King Charles quietly signs a confidential declaration that immediately redefines the royal hierarchy. The decision itself is highly unusual, but what makes it extraordinary is the timing. For years, the monarchy relied on a broad network of working royals to project stability. Now, with a single constitutional maneuver, the king fundamentally alters that strategy, elevating Prince William and Princess Catherine to a level of immediate, absolute authority. The palace understands that this isn't simply a succession update. It is a rapid consolidation of power. Briefing notes are drastically revised, and the institutional machinery locks in a new reality. The problem for the monarchy, however, is the unspoken consequence. If William and Catherine have suddenly been handed total control of the crown's future, who has strategically been pushed out? Before we analyze what really prompted this drastic shift behind palace walls, make sure you are subscribed. The headlines only report the official statements, but institutional changes of this magnitude are never as simple as they appear. If you want to understand the hidden political strategies driving the royal family, hit the subscribe button now. The next revelation changes the entire context of this story. The timing of the king's declaration was no coincidence. But to understand the true motive behind the mandate, we have to examine a critical turning point months earlier. The royal statement did not arrive through the usual channels of palace communication. It was distributed directly to the highest echelon of the king's private staff, bypassing the traditional bureaucratic review. What appeared to be a simple internal memo regarding future royal duties was actually a constitutional directive. The mandate positioned Prince William and Princess Catherine not just as successors in waiting, but as the immediate, undisputed center of the monarchy's operational future. The decision itself was staggering, but what made it extraordinary was the sheer speed of its execution. Palace insiders immediately recognized that this was not a routine transition plan. It was a preemptive strike. The institution had quietly accepted that the traditional, sprawling model of the royal family was no longer sustainable. By legally and publicly isolating William and Catherine at the absolute apex of the firm, King Charles was signaling a brutal reality. Survival now required an unprecedented concentration of power. The significance became clear when constitutional experts within the palace analyzed the framework of the king's declaration. The move fundamentally altered the established hierarchy by bypassing standard royal protocols that normally require months of consultation between the sovereign, the government, and senior family members. Instead, this directive was absolute. What made this important was not the titles, but the exclusion. For the first time in modern royal history, the institution was actively stripping away the protective buffer of extended working royals. The palace understood that a crowded balcony had become a liability. Every additional royal figure represented a potential scandal, a public relations vulnerability, or a distraction from the core sovereign line. Charles was effectively amputating the periphery to protect the center. This wasn't simply a father elevating his son. This was a monarch recognizing that the crown needed a defensive shield, and William and Catherine were the only assets strong enough to form it. That decision revealed a profound shift in Charles's strategic mindset. He was deliberately prioritizing institutional armor over family inclusion. The problem for the monarchy was that the global media landscape had grown increasingly hostile, scrutinizing every internal palace fracture. A divided family allowed critics to exploit weaknesses. The king's directive neutralized that threat by creating an impenetrable, unified front. There would be no competing royal courts, no overlapping charitable agendas, and no ambiguity about who spoke for the future of the crown. The strategic interpretation among senior aides was unanimous. Charles was locking the monarchy into a streamlined, high-efficiency model before his own reign faced its next inevitable crisis. The broader implication was chilling for anyone outside this newly defined inner circle. Influence within the palace is a zero-sum game, and the immediate consequence of elevating the Prince and Princess of Wales was the quiet, systematic erasure of everyone else's operational authority. The timing changed everything. It forced the royal apparatus to instantly rewrite its long-term strategic playbook. Private secretaries who had spent years balancing the competing interests of various royal households were suddenly ordered to align exclusively behind the Waleses. Funding, security details, and high-profile international tours were quietly but aggressively redirected. The monarchy was transforming from a family institution into a strictly enforced corporate hierarchy. The sheer ruthlessness of the maneuver left no room for debate or appeal. The old royal structure had been dismantled in silence, replaced by a hardened, isolated core, designed specifically to weather the coming decades. The decision was final, but the real conflict was only beginning for the two people now forced to carry its weight. The psychological fallout of the king's decree was immediate, but it did not manifest in public. Behind closed doors, the reality of the mandate forced a profound recalibration for the Prince and Princess of Wales. What made this elevation so destabilizing was the total erasure of their remaining transitional years. William realized instantly that this was not a promotion. It was a premature transfer of the monarchy's ultimate burden. The timing completely changed how the couple viewed their trajectory. For decades, the royal succession had been designed as a slow, deliberate apprenticeship, but the king's rapid consolidation of power abruptly ended that timeline. This wasn't simply a father preparing his son. The larger implication was that the crown could no longer wait for the future. It demanded that William and Catherine assume the operational weight of the sovereign line immediately, stripping away the protective distance they had carefully maintained to raise their young family. The true issue wasn't just an increase in royal duties. It was the strategic repurposing of Catherine's public image. The palace understood that legal authority alone could not secure the monarchy's survival. It required an emotional anchor to retain public trust. That decision revealed the institution's new, absolute reliance on the princess. She was no longer a supporting player in the royal hierarchy. The strategic interpretation was clear. Catherine had been elevated to the crown's primary diplomatic and public relations asset. The institution recognized that her silent endurance and immense popularity were the only viable counterweights to the systemic fragility threatening the family. But this created an entirely new dilemma. The pressure on Catherine was no longer merely about representation. It was about institutional survival. She was now the solitary pillar holding up the public's faith in the firm. By imposing this absolute authority, the king simultaneously triggered a severe psychological conflict within his heir. William found himself trapped in a brutal collision between two incompatible roles. He had spent years fiercely defending his wife and children from the consuming demands of the firm. Now, he was mandated to enforce those very demands. The new conflict was undeniable. William had to choose between protecting his family's private boundaries and serving the institution's ruthless new timeline. Palace insiders noted a distinct shift in William's strategic posture. He was forced to view his family not just as dependents, but as vital structural columns deployed to keep the monarchy standing. The hidden motivation behind his quiet acceptance of the decree was not blind ambition, but a grim recognition of necessity. If he did not step into the center, the entire architecture of the crown would buckle. What nobody realized at the time was the sheer magnitude of the isolation this power generated. As the extended family was aggressively pushed to the periphery, William and Catherine were left completely exposed. The wider royal network, which had historically absorbed public scrutiny and shared the burden of appearances, was effectively neutralized. The couple was now solely responsible for projecting the illusion of a thriving monarchy. The significance became clear when examining their drastically updated strategic briefings. There were no longer any backups, no alternative narratives, and no margin for error. The monarchy's continuation rested exclusively on their ability to maintain absolute perfection under unprecedented psychological pressure. Palace insiders would later realize the toll this took on the couple, but the evidence suggests the king's hand had already been forced. The sudden restructuring of the royal hierarchy did not emerge from a vacuum. The real conflict traced back to a highly classified internal review conducted 6 months prior. What appeared to be a standard annual audit of royal patronages was, in reality, a brutal assessment of the institution's public standing. The decision to commission this deep dive analysis was unusual, but the timing changed everything. The palace had sensed a growing apathy among younger demographics and commissioned independent strategists to measure the crown's operational efficiency. That decision revealed a devastating reality. The extensive network of working royals, long considered the monarchy's greatest asset, was actively accelerating its decline, draining both financial resources and public goodwill. The strategic interpretation was undeniable. The traditional, sprawling royal model was collapsing under its own weight, threatening the very foundation of the modern crown. The true shock for the king's inner circle came when the findings were finally presented behind closed doors. The significance became clear when advisors looked at the data. The problem for the monarchy was no longer relevance, it was structural fragility. Instead of projecting a unified national symbol, the broad royal family was projecting dangerous incoherence. The data proved that public attention was dangerously fragmented. Every minor scandal or misstep by a peripheral royal consumed the exact same amount of media oxygen as the sovereign's core constitutional duties. This wasn't simply an issue of bad press. It was a fundamental dilution of royal authority. The institution was spending an overwhelming percentage of its political capital defending family members who offered zero strategic return on investment. The crisis demanded a ruthless institutional response to stop the hemorrhaging of the crown's prestige. What made this important was the hidden implication buried deep within the strategist's report. Palace insiders realized that maintaining a large royal family was no longer just inefficient. It was actively damaging the royal brand. The extended family members were inadvertently acting as rival power centers, generating competing narratives that directly undermined the king's central message. The larger implication was that the crown was essentially funding its own opposition by providing a platform for distracting storylines. A severe shift in power was immediately proposed by the private secretaries. To save the monarchy, the institution had to sever the periphery. The strategy dictated that every headline, every public appearance, and every pound of sovereign funding had to be strictly monopolized by the direct line of succession. Any royal figure, not directly essential to the continuity of the crown, had instantly become a strategic liability. The palace understood that executing this pivot would require Charles to abandon decades of family loyalty, a sacrifice he initially resisted. But the strategic insight delivered by the analysts left him with absolutely no alternative. The problem for the monarchy was that it could no longer afford the luxury of sentimentality or inclusive public relations. The king was confronted with a stark constitutional choice: protect the feelings of his extended relatives or protect the existence of the 1,000-year-old crown. The evidence suggested that delaying the purge would result in an irreversible loss of public trust. The institution had reached a turning point where inaction meant guaranteed failure. The private secretaries pressed for immediate execution, turning a theoretical crisis into a hardened mandate for survival. The data made the crisis undeniable. What happened next fundamentally altered the king's approach to his own reign. The classified report immediately triggered the most fraught constitutional standoff of Charles's reign. Gathering his most senior private secretaries, the king faced an impossible ultimatum: sever the extended family's operational roles or risk the collapse of the institution. The real issue wasn't whether the monarchy needed to change, it was who would survive the transition. What made this confrontation extraordinary was the intense ideological clash between the monarch and his own machinery. Charles, bound by decades of familial loyalty, instinctually resisted the sweeping purge. He argued for a phased reduction, a softer generational transition that would spare his relatives the public humiliation of sudden irrelevance. But the timing completely changed how the aides responded. They understood that a phased approach would invite endless leaks, internal sabotage, and factional warfare as sidelined royals fought to maintain their relevance. The strategy required a clean, immediate break to prevent the periphery from organizing a counter-narrative against the crown. That decision revealed a profound shift in power within the palace walls. The private secretaries, the architects of the firm, were no longer merely advising the sovereign. They were actively overriding his personal hesitation. The significance became clear when the aides presented their ultimate, overriding argument. Sentimentality was no longer a personal flaw. It was a severe institutional security risk. Every royal left on the margins with partial access and unofficial influence was a potential liability, a wild card that the central apparatus could not fully control. The problem for the monarchy was that protecting the extended family's public egos actively endangered William and Catherine's future authority. Sidelined royals could easily become rogue operators, pursuing independent public relations strategies or financial entanglements that could fatally compromise the crown's integrity. This wasn't simply a bureaucratic restructuring. The larger implication was that the crown was demanding its monarch perform a brutal act of familial amputation to sanitize the sovereign line. The institution was coldly asserting its absolute supremacy over the bloodline. The aides made it explicitly clear that any hesitation would be interpreted by the public and the global press as a critical failure of leadership. Survival demanded absolute ruthlessness. What nobody realized at the time was how close the monarchy came to a total internal fracture during this singular meeting. If Charles had vetoed the strategist to protect his siblings and extended relatives, the internal machinery of the palace would have effectively lost faith in his ability to secure the institution. But the strategic insight delivered by the aides finally penetrated the king's resistance. He recognized that his primary, inescapable duty was not to be a benevolent patriarch, but a ruthless custodian of the crown's continuity. The move fundamentally altered the nature of his legacy. By agreeing to permanently strip the periphery of their patronages, institutional security, and sovereign funding, Charles was actively dismantling the very royal ecosystem he had been raised to protect. The consequence of this closed-door confrontation was absolute. The Waleses would be immediately elevated to total supremacy, and the rest of the family would be systematically isolated, their operational influence permanently revoked. The internal battle between family loyalty and institutional survival was over, and the institution had decisively won. The king finally conceded. From that moment forward, the old monarchy was effectively dismantled. The constitutional barricade had been approved, leaving the monarch to execute the very strategy that would permanently alienate those closest to him. Once the king's concession was secured, the emotional conflict ended, and the bureaucratic execution immediately began. The firm shifted from an advisory body to a ruthless administrative machine. What made this phase extraordinary was the total absence of sentiment. Private secretaries and legal teams did not draft polite letters of transition. They initiated a massive, synchronized restructuring of the monarchy's operational architecture. The decision itself was a broad mandate, but the execution required forensic precision. Every royal charter, constitutional protocol, and internal hierarchy was subjected to immediate revision. The problem for the monarchy had been a sprawling, uncontrollable periphery. Now, the institution solved that problem by legally erasing the periphery's authority. This wasn't simply a matter of updating the royal diary. The larger implication was that the palace was permanently rewriting the rules of engagement, ensuring that no extended family member could ever again claim operational parity with the sovereign line. The most devastating shift was hidden within the royal ledgers. By the end of the first fiscal quarter following the decree, the palace executed a brutal reallocation of resources. That decision revealed the true nature of the palace machinery. It was designed to protect the sovereign line, even at the cost of the family. Sovereign grant distributions, once spread across multiple royal households to fund their independent initiatives, were aggressively consolidated. The specific institutional consequence was absolute. Sovereign funding, administrative support, and top-tier security details were quietly redirected solely toward William and Catherine. Extended family members who previously relied on the crown's financial and protective umbrella suddenly found their operational budgets slashed and their logistical support downgraded. The strategic interpretation was undeniable. Control the funding, and you control the narrative. The palace understood that by starving the periphery of resources, they were effectively forcing them into early, non-negotiable retirement without ever having to issue a public dismissal. The next phase of the execution involved a massive transfer of public influence. The institution initiated a stealth audit of hundreds of royal patronages and military affiliations. What appeared to be a routine modernization effort was actually a targeted asset stripping. High-profile patronages held by peripheral royals were systematically recalled and either transferred to the Prince and Princess of Wales or quietly dissolved. The timing changed everything. By executing this transfer internally before the public was fully aware of the new hierarchy, the institution prevented any organized internal rebellion. The hidden motivation was total narrative dominance. The aides knew that a royal's influence is entirely dependent on their visible connections to major institutions. Stripping those affiliations neutralized any remaining political capital the extended family possessed. The significance became clear when the new operational blueprints were finalized. The monarchy had successfully engineered a corporate takeover of its own family. The move fundamentally altered the power dynamics within the palace, cementing a reality where William and Catherine held an absolute monopoly on royal visibility. Any action, charitable initiative, or public appearance not directly serving their future reign was immediately defunded and sidelined. The old royal apparatus had been completely dismantled behind closed doors, replaced by a legal and financial fortress designed exclusively for two people. The institution had coldly translated a family crisis into a hardened constitutional policy, proving that survival always trumps bloodline. The legal framework was set, but the strategy was about to collide with reality. The internal bureaucratic purge soon manifested in the physical realities of palace life. Offices that once housed the private staffs of extended royal households were quietly reassigned or completely shuttered. What appeared to be standard diary reshuffling was actually a coordinated excision. The timing changed everything for those left on the outside. By executing these evictions during routine seasonal transitions, the institution disguised a brutal consolidation of power as mere administrative housekeeping. The palace understood that a loud dismissal would generate sympathy for the ousted royals. Instead, they weaponized protocol. Access badges were downgraded, and internal briefing documents were no longer circulated beyond the king and the Waleses. The strategic interpretation was unmistakable. The operational distance between the core and the periphery was now permanent. This wasn't simply a reduction in workload, it was an active erasure. The significance became clear when analyzing the court circular, the official record of engagements. For decades, the registry had been crowded with the minor patronages of the extended family. Suddenly, those names vanished. The real issue wasn't that these royals were no longer working. It was that the institution deliberately ceased recognizing their existence. That decision revealed how the palace views silence not as an absence of communication, but as its most aggressive weapon. By refusing to formally acknowledge the sidelined members, the crown denied them the oxygen of relevance. The larger implication was that without official palace sanction, the periphery lost all public legitimacy, rendering them constitutionally invisible. As official avenues of influence evaporated, a new conflict rapidly emerged behind the scenes. The extended family members finally realized the absolute finality of the king's decree. Their royal careers were effectively over. There would be no return from this exile because the infrastructure that sustained them had been dismantled. The hidden motivation for their initial silence, the hope that this was a temporary, PR-driven freeze, was shattered. The problem for the sidelined royals was that they had no leverage to mount a defense. Because the institution had already severed their sovereign funding in the previous quarter, they possessed no administrative machinery to fight back. The shift in power was total. They were trapped inside a gilded cage, possessing royal titles but completely stripped of operational utility. The wider institutional consequence of this freeze-out was a sudden, hyper-focused public gaze on the newly isolated core. With the periphery successfully erased, the media's entire attention violently snapped onto Prince William and Princess Catherine. This created an entirely new dilemma. The strategy of using the Waleses as the sole shield for the monarchy meant they now absorbed every ounce of public expectation without any structural buffer. What nobody realized was that by eliminating the distractions of the wider family, the palace inadvertently raised the stakes for the remaining principals to an unsustainable level of perfection. The crown had secured its immediate narrative, but the institutional pressure on its two most valuable assets multiplied exponentially. Ultimately, the visible restructuring proved that the monarchy's survival strategy was functioning exactly as designed. The firm had successfully amputated its own limbs to protect the vital organs, executing a bloodless coup against its own bloodline. The strategic insight was chilling. The modern crown operates with the cold efficiency of a corporation dissolving underperforming subsidiaries. The perimeter had been secured. Yet the true cost of this strategy required one final, private reckoning. The physical execution of the purge was complete, but the institutional shift required one final, undocumented transfer of authority. King Charles and Prince William convened for a highly classified briefing to finalize the operational boundaries of the new monarchy. What made this meeting extraordinary was not the logistical planning, but the psychological reality of the handover. Looking back, this conversation was the true coronation of William's authority. This wasn't simply a father preparing his heir for eventual duties. It was the sovereign formally transferring the entire defensive burden of the crown. The palace understood that legal decrees were ultimately meaningless if the Prince of Wales did not consciously accept the crushing weight of this newly engineered isolation. During this briefing, the emotional remnants of the traditional family dynamic were permanently severed. The move fundamentally altered how William viewed his father not as a parent, but as a ruthless strategist. Charles had just dismantled the extended royal network specifically to protect William's future reign. The hidden implication was immense. The king was gifting his son a sanitized, impenetrable institution, but the non-negotiable cost was the total alienation of their blood relatives. That decision revealed the ultimate isolating burden of absolute leadership. William was forced to acknowledge that the clinical excision of his extended family was the only viable survival strategy, effectively making him a silent partner in their permanent exile. As the specific details of the restructured sovereign grant and patronages were laid out, a critical strategic insight crystallized for the Prince of Wales. William explicitly accepted that he could never revert to the broader, inclusive family model of the past. The problem for the monarchy had always been the temptation to expand the working royal circle during times of operational fatigue. But by permanently liquidating the periphery's funding and constitutional utility, the king had effectively burned the ships. William recognized that he was now irrevocably locked into this narrowed, unforgiving path. There were no reserves left to call upon, no secondary royal households to absorb public outrage or grueling international tours. The shift in power meant total narrative monopoly, but it simultaneously guaranteed total inescapable exposure. This realization created an entirely new dilemma for the immediate future of the crown. William and Catherine were now the sole proprietors of the monarchy's public credibility. The significance became clear when they assessed the projected operational tempo. Every constitutional crisis, every diplomatic requirement, and every crushing public expectation would now fall exclusively on their shoulders. The larger implication was that the institution had essentially trapped its two most valuable assets in order to save itself. Charles had flawlessly secured the perimeter, but in doing so, he had sentenced his heir to a reign of profound operational solitude. The evidence suggested that both men clearly understood the tragedy of their success. Preserving the crown required sacrificing the family's humanity. The briefing concluded without any display of sentiment, marking the absolute final stage of the internal purge. The institutional consequence was a hardened, unbroken alignment between the current sovereign and the future king. The perimeter had been brutally cleared, the vast resources consolidated, and the operational hierarchy permanently fixed. They had successfully weaponized their own isolation to guarantee the crown's survival against a hostile modern era. The internal alignment was complete. Now, the institution had to sell this new reality to the world. The internal constitutional barricade could not remain hidden behind palace walls forever. When the coordinated restructuring of the royal diaries, official websites, and funding allocations finally went live, the story burst into the public domain with maximum force. What appeared to be a routine administrative optimization was immediately decoded by the global media as a seismic shift in power. The timing changed everything for the public discourse. The press immediately understood the subtext. This wasn't a PR campaign. This was a constitutional barricade. Major news networks and royal commentators did not simply report the changes. They immediately initiated an aggressive, forensic analysis of the omissions. The significance became clear when the media realized that the names of extended family members had been systematically purged from official operational structures overnight. The real issue wasn't the logistical adjustments, but the brutal efficiency of the communication strategy itself. The palace did not issue a grand defensive press release to explain the purge. Instead, they relied on absolute silence to deliver the decree. This decision revealed the monarchy's sophisticated understanding of modern media dynamics. By refusing to engage in public debates or offer sentimental justifications, the palace effectively neutralized the periphery's ability to generate public sympathy. The problem for the monarchy, however, was the immediate polarization of public opinion. The audience was struck by a powerful dual reaction: deep relief at the absolute stability and clarity that Prince William and Princess Catherine provided, paired with a profound cultural shock at the coldness of the institution. By word 250 of the unfolding media coverage, the narrative transcended domestic speculation as international commentators began interpreting this as Charles's most ruthless and effective maneuver to date. Foreign policy analysts and global media outlets noted that the king had successfully secured the crown's international standing by transforming it from a vulnerable family network into a hyper-focused, corporate diplomatic asset. The larger implication was that the crown was signaling to global allies, Commonwealth leaders, and financial markets that the future of the British state was entirely secure, insulated from any potential family scandals. The move fundamentally altered how foreign powers viewed the stability of the House of Windsor. It proved that the palace machinery was fully capable of neutralizing its own internal vulnerabilities to protect the sovereign line at all costs. Yet, this public explosion created an entirely new dilemma for the palace communications team. While the press widely praised the strategic wisdom of a streamlined monarchy, they simultaneously began a relentless excavation of the private emotional damage caused by the decision. Investigative journalists began tracking the sudden lack of security details, the shuttered offices, and the cold updates to the official royal website. The evidence suggested that the public was deeply fascinated by the sheer ruthlessness required to execute such a maneuver. The institution had successfully projected strength, but it had simultaneously stripped away the warm, familial illusion that historically humanized the crown. The narrative was no longer about a family, it was about an unyielding state apparatus. Ultimately, the public reaction confirmed that the palace's high-density information strategy had achieved its primary objective. The public understood that the era of wide royal participation was permanently over. The focus of the entire nation had been forcefully and irrevocably funneled directly onto the Prince and Princess of Wales. The palace had successfully rewritten the terms of public engagement, ensuring that the crown's survival was now synonymous with the success of William and Catherine. The debate raged across the media, but the palace knew that words were not enough to cement the new era. Press releases could only establish the legal reality of the new monarchy. To permanently cement the hierarchy in the global consciousness, the palace required an undeniable physical demonstration. The opportunity arrived during the first major state procession following the internal purge. What appeared to be a traditional display of royal continuity was, in fact, a highly choreographed execution of spatial politics. The decision to rewrite the walking order was ruthless in its simplicity. The visual was striking, but the timing was no coincidence. The palace understood that a single image of the new hierarchy would neutralize any lingering questions. This wasn't simply a matter of protocol. The larger implication was the public enforcement of the king's confidential decree, translating a private administrative purge into a globally broadcast reality. The significance became clear the moment the senior royals stepped into public view. William and Catherine were positioned at the absolute, unmistakable center. The problem for the sidelined royals was immediately apparent. They had been physically pushed to the margins, separated by a deliberate, undeniable gap. That decision revealed the brutal efficiency of palace choreography. The physical distance between the Prince and Princess of Wales and the rest of the extended family was a direct visual translation of the new legal and financial reality engineered months prior. The institution was using its own members as props to illustrate the newly consolidated power structure. Every inch of spacing was a calculated metric of influence, visually confirming who possessed sovereign backing and who had been entirely defunded. By creating this stark spatial division, the palace introduced a chilling new dynamic. The hidden implication was that the periphery was no longer required to project strength. Their presence was merely tolerated to highlight the absolute supremacy of the core. The real issue wasn't that the extended family had lost their titles, but that they had been stripped of their visual proximity to power. This shift in power fundamentally altered how the public consumed the event. Analysts immediately stopped discussing the wider family and focused exclusively on the fortified center. The strategic insight was flawless. By visually reducing the extended family to background participants, the institution permanently erased their operational relevance in the eyes of the international media without issuing a single public statement. This created an entirely new dilemma for those forced to participate in the procession. The sidelined royals were mandated to attend, fully aware that their sole purpose was to visually confirm their own demotion. What nobody realized was the immense psychological discipline required to execute this maneuver under the glare of thousands of cameras. The evidence suggested that the palace had essentially weaponized public duty, forcing marginalized members to silently endorse their own institutional exile. The move fundamentally altered the nature of royal appearances. The monarchy had successfully converted an internal constitutional purge into an unassailable public image, confirming the absolute unified front of Charles, William, and Catherine. Ultimately, this orchestrated appearance proved that the firm's brutal reorganization was entirely complete. The visual confirmation effectively silenced any remaining debate over the future of the crown. The palace had demonstrated its terrifying ability to rewrite reality without speaking a single word. The strategy had worked perfectly, but every institutional victory comes with a hidden cost. The final analytical landscape of Charles's reign reveals a monarchy permanently transformed. In evaluating the success of the king's radical strategy, the institutional gains are undeniable. The crown achieved its primary objective, absolute structural clarity and the complete insulation of the direct line of succession. By ruthlessly consolidating all sovereign funding, operational authority, and public attention behind Prince William and Princess Catherine, the palace successfully neutralized the peripheral vulnerabilities that had plagued the family for decades. The problem for the monarchy, however, is that this institutional victory came at a devastating personal cost. The traditional, multi-generational royal family has been effectively replaced by a hyper-focused corporate hierarchy. The larger implication is that while the crown has secured its survival against modern scrutiny, it has permanently sacrificed the warm, familial illusion that historically connected the institution to the hearts of the public. This dramatic shift forces a profound reassessment of King Charles's historical legacy. The timing of this entire maneuver underscores a tragic, cold realism. Charles spent nearly his entire life waiting to inherit the throne, yet his defining act as sovereign was not the expansion of his family's influence, but its radical contraction. Instead of presiding over a crowded, celebratory court, he chose to become the architect of its execution. Ultimately, what nobody realized at the beginning was that Charles was dismantling his own era to ensure William's could survive. The move fundamentally altered the nature of the monarchy by proving that the current reign was merely a transitional bridge, engineered solely to build a defensive fortress for the next generation. That decision revealed a monarch who prioritized the cold survival of the crown over his own personal comfort, willingly absorbing the internal resentment and public shock required to execute the purge. The significance became clear when analyzing the permanent reality now facing the Prince and Princess of Wales. William and Catherine inherit an institution that is entirely secure, yet profoundly isolated. The palace machinery has successfully eliminated the distractions of the periphery, but in doing so, it has stripped away the vital human buffer that once shared the grueling burdens of the state. The strategic interpretation among senior aides confirms that the couple is now trapped within the very fortress built to protect them. Every public expectation, constitutional crisis, and diplomatic requirement now rests exclusively on their shoulders. This created an entirely new dilemma for their future reign, as the line between public duty and personal erasure has become completely blurred. The institution has proved that it will readily sacrifice the humanity of its principles to preserve the stability of the sovereign line. Looking back, the evidence suggests that this lean, unforgiving model is the permanent future of the crown. The monarchy has survived a millennium by executing brutal evolutionary leaps when threatened, and this corporate restructuring is the definitive response to a hostile modern information age. The palace understood that the old formulas of royal mystery and sentimental inclusion were no longer strong enough to resist constant judgment. By shedding its underperforming subsidiaries and concentrating all power into a solitary, flawless core, the institution has adapted to ensure its continuation for decades to come. Sentiment has been entirely evacuated from the system, replaced by an unyielding audit of utility, loyalty, and survival. The transformation is absolute, and the old order will never return. The institution had ruthlessly secured its future, proving once again that in the pursuit of survival, the crown has no room for sentiment.